Good evening. Now, we're going to continue our lesson series in Babylon. This is the next ancient civilization that we're going to look at tonight. Now, Babylon, we have bounced around it throughout these lessons. Babylon is through the Fertile Crescent. You have Babylon, the city, and then you have Babylonia, the region. Now, Babylonia, the kingdom, the empire, grew and waned throughout the centuries, from the flood to the first century BC. So at its height, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this is roughly where the extent of the empire existed. This is under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar and Nabopolassar, the ones that we are familiar with, the kings we're familiar with. Now Babylon, the city itself, is along the Euphrates River, right here. So it is just a little bit northwest of which we've studied. Babylon sits currently just 30 miles outside of Baghdad. So it's in Iraq. They have found the city of Babylon. So we know where it's at, and they've done excavations and so on. And we're going to get a little bit more into that. When we look at the Babylonian timeline, once we have the flood, the first king to really put Babylon together was King Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi is really early on in the history of Babylon, about 1795 to 1750. The next period after his kingdom kind of fell, they fell to the Kassites. The Kassites were a mixture of peoples of the Amalekites and the Hittites, so a combination of two peoples. Then you move into the Assyrians. Now, we talked about them at length last time, and so they controlled Babylon for several hundred years. Then you moved into the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, this is where we are familiar with Babylon. That's the Babylon of Daniel. That's the Babylon of Jeremiah and Isaiah. That is this Babylon. And we're going to talk at length on this Babylon here in a few minutes. After the Neo-Babylonian Empire fell, you fell to the Persians and the Medes. And they held on to it for a few hundred years. And then after that, in 331 BC, the kingdom fell to Alexander the Great. He was on his way conquering the world. He conquered Babylon and Persia. And so he went all the way to Babylon. He continued on to India. About that time is when his old soldiers said, "We're tired, we want to go home." So he left India alone and started coming back. On his way back, he stopped in Babylon, and this is where he made his final home. He set up his palace there in Babylon, and in 323 BC, he died there under very suspicious circumstances. But we'll get into that in a few months whenever we get to Greece. But this is where one of the greatest kings of all time, most powerful kings of all time, resided. And so it's a powerhouse throughout all of these periods. Now, whenever we look at Babylon the city, there are some things to note about. Now, Babylon was constructed post-flood by Nimrod. That is the grandson of Ham. Now, Nimrod is the city builder. He's the one that built and Nimrud and Babylon. He is the builder of this city. And there's really no disputing that. The city was built across the Euphrates River. The city was divided in half. On one side sat the temple, and on the other side sat the palace. So that's how the city was broken up. Now, we do have some descriptions about this city. Now, there are ancient historians you've heard of. You've heard of Herodotus. If you haven't, well, you need to. He is one of the few historians we actually have his writings of still, mostly intact. Now, Josephus, you've heard of him. He references some of Herodotus's work. That's a hard one to say. He references some of it, but we have some of the original workings of Herodotus. Now, Herodotus was a traveler in the 400s BC. So it was 484 to 425 BC. And he traveled to Egypt, he traveled to Babylon, he traveled to Nineveh. He got around, and he wrote descriptions of where he went. This is the description he came up with for Babylon, and I just want to read it to you. It just makes it easier to not miss something. He said, "The city is in the form of a square. It's 14 miles on each side and of enormous magnitude. The brick wall was 56 miles long, 300 feet high, 25 feet thick, with another wall 75 feet behind the first wall, and the walls extended 35 feet below the ground." Now, just stop there for a second. Most scholars believe Herodotus really didn't get out there and get it with a measuring stick and figure out how tall these things were. 300 feet high, Chase Tower is 400 feet high. So 3/4 of the Chase Tower, that's how tall he's saying these walls are. Most scholars say this is probably not accurate. because that would be really hard to build a city that big. But they have confirmed, or at least semi-confirmed, that the 14 miles across and 14 miles wide, that is about the dimensions of the city. But most scholars say that the city walls were probably closer to 40 to 50 feet tall rather than 300 feet tall. I'm just throwing that out there because Herodotus, I think, got carried away. That's the only reason I'm throwing that out there. Either that or it's a mistranslation. That has been known to happen. Somebody forgot to put the dot in the decimal point in the Greek text, and there you go. Now, there are 250 towers that were 450 feet high, that missing decimal point, a wide and deep moat that encircled the city. The Euphrates River also flowed through the middle of the city. Ferry boats and a half-mile-long drawbridge that closed at night were there. It had 8 massive gates that led its way into the inner city and 100 brass gates. The Great Tower, or the Ziggurat, that there were 53 temples, including the Great Temple of Marduk, and 180 altars to Ishtar. The golden image of Baal and the golden table, both weighing over 50,000 pounds in solid gold. 2 golden lions and a solid gold human figure 18 feet high. And Nebuchadnezzar's palace was considered the most magnificent building ever constructed on earth. Now these are the words of Herodotus writing these. So this is a Greek traveler, and if you look at Greek architecture, they knew how to build things. Herodotus is looking at architecture that was built 200 years before he existed, during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was around the 600s BC. He's in the 400s BC. And this stuff is still standing, and it's that impressive to this Greek traveler. So that tells you something about this place. Now, when you look at this is just an artist's rendering of what the city may have looked like. You've got a huge city. You've got the giant, the tower walls. You've got the moat that goes around it. You've got gates on every little bridge that goes across the moat. You've got the towers. You've got the river that splits the city in half. You've got the Tower of Marduk. You've got the temple palaces. Just kind of give you a scale of what this might have looked like. This is still being excavated. This has not been completed. So it's just artists' interpretation of what has been written. Now, one of the other pieces of notoriety to Babylon is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Now, that is another piece that we have not discovered. It's been destroyed. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world at the time of Herodotus. He's the one that, based on his travels, this is what he was finding was most impressive, and they were determined later to be the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, what we know about the Hanging Gardens, there has been several accounts written by not only Herodotus, but by Strabo and a few other Greek travelers, and I want to read a few of those synopses of those pieces of the Hanging Gardens. According to accounts, the gardens were built to cheer up Nebuchadnezzar's homesick wife, Amytis. Amytis, daughter of the king of Medes, was married to Nebuchadnezzar to create an alliance between the 2 nations. The land she came from, though, was green, rugged, and mountainous, and she found the flat, sun-baked terrain of Mesopotamia depressing. The king decided to relieve her depression by recreating her homeland through the building of an artificial mountain with rooftop gardens. The Hanging Gardens probably did not really hang in the sense of being suspended from cables or ropes. The name comes from an inexact translation of the Greek word krimatos, or the Latin word pensilis, which means not just hanging, but overhanging, as in the case of a terrace or balcony. The Greek geographer Strabo, who described the gardens in 1st century BC, so this is about 500 years after they were built, it consists of vaulted terraces raised one above another and resting upon cube-shaped pillars. These are hollow and filled with earth to allow trees of the largest size to be planted. The pillars, the vaults, and terraces are constructed of baked brick and asphalt. The ascent to the highest story is by stairs, and at their side are water engines, by means of which persons appointed expressly for the purpose are continually employed in raising water from the Euphrates into the garden. So this is something that was built. It's not only a feat of architectural engineering, but getting trees 5 stories up, water to those. That's a lot. They had water engines. They had people up there just turning water all the time to get that stuff up to the top. And this was 500 years that Strabo's writing about it since it was built. And it's still in operation. Okay, I know you know this, but this nation's only been around 250 years. Okay, think about that. You're going twice as far back, and things are still working. This is stuff that's lasting forever. They knew how to build this stuff. So this is very impressive to me. Now, we have excavated about 10% of Babylon, and one of the excavations dug up what's known as the Ishtar Gate. Now, this is a rebuilding of the Ishtar Gate. This is not just a facsimile. This was excavated by German archaeologists in 1902. It is now standing in the Berlin Museum, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And this is only a portion of the Ishtar Gate. This is the front part of the entrance. It's actually twice as wide and about twice as deep. But these are the blue tiles they dug out of the site and reconnected them, pieced them back together, and started assembling it again. And there were a few pieces missing, so they had to go and make some more tile and fill in a few blanks. But this is original artwork. This is original coloring from what the Ishtar Gate looked like. Now, this is beautiful. I mean, I would have this in my house. I mean, it's a beautiful tile work. So even the beauty of it. And I want you to focus just a little bit on that beauty, because the city of Babylon, as you've seen in the description that Herodotus gave it, you see gold, gold, gold. You see towers, you see monuments, you see pillars, you just see this magnificence built around Babylon. Now, in the Ishtar Gate, there was a plaque. There was a dedication plaque written by Nebuchadnezzar. And I want to read that to you, because we've heard the name Nebuchadnezzar. We know what it says in Daniel, in Chronicles, and in Kings about Nebuchadnezzar. But this is a side of Nebuchadnezzar that really confirms what we already knew, but it's something you probably never heard. And I want to read this snippet from him. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the pious prince appointed by the will of Marduk, the highest priestly prince, beloved of Nabu, of prudent deliberation, who has learnt to embrace wisdom, who fathomed their godly being and pays reverence to their majesty, the untiring governor, who always has at heart the care of the cult of Esgilia and Azida, and is constantly concerned with the well-being of Babylon and Borsippa, the wise, the humble, the caretaker of Esgilia and Azida, the firstborn son of Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon, I am. It's quite a title, wouldn't you say? Do you think this guy had an ego? Do you think this guy thought something of himself? And these are his words put in this dedication plaque. This is what he thought of himself. The man is very proud of himself, very vain, very arrogant, as we know. So this is what he said about the Ishtar Gate. He says, both the gate entrances of the city walls, Imjer Elil and Nemeti Elil, following the filling of the streets from Babylon, had become increasingly lower. Therefore, I pulled down these gates and laid their foundations at the water table with asphalt bricks and had them made of bricks with blue stone, on which wonderful bulls and dragons were depicted. I covered their roofs by laying majestic cedars lengthwise over them. I fixed doors of cedar wood, adorned with bronze, at all the gate openings. I placed wild bulls and ferocious dragons in the gateways, and thus adorned them with luxurious splendor, so that mankind might gaze in them in wonder. For centuries, this city was considered a wondrous city. Herodotus, 200 years later, was writing about it. Strabo, 500 years later, was writing about it. Here we are, 2,500 years later, and I'm talking about it. It was a magnificent city. And so keep that in mind as we look at Babylon. Now, one thing I do, as I was preparing this lesson, I was listening to the radio, to NPR, and I found out something. On July 5th, 2019, Babylon became a World Heritage Site. So this is new. You would have thought that they would have arranged that earlier. Now, none of you seem excited about this. Okay, I'm going to change your mind. The fact that it is now a World Heritage Site tells you something that the world is saying this place is important, not only to the history of Iraq, but the history of the world. It means the international community finds value on this site. Now, it not only protects it from damage of vandals, but it protects it from damage of others that don't mean to vandalize it. Whenever we went into Iraq in the wars, the U.S. military built a base of operation in the city ruins. We were doing damage to it. Not maliciously, but now it is protected from that. Now, the reason you should get excited about this is why I get excited about this. Whenever they start excavating it, I've said they've only excavated about 10% of the city. But when they get around to excavating it, what are they going to find? They're going to find libraries. They're going to find inscriptions on the walls. They're going to find tablets. They're going to find all sorts of information that's going to justify and ratify the Bible. Things, throughout history, we've lost so much history. We don't know what it was like in ancient Babylon or ancient Mesopotamia, but the Babylonians did. When we unearth that, we get to read it finally. And we get to start piecing the world's history together. And we'll find out we were right the whole time. And the more we dig out of those ruins, the more our cause is justified, or that's not the word I'm looking for, but you understand what I mean. So folks, get excited. It's a World Heritage Site. That is important to us. Anytime you hear that, that is a win for Christianity, whether you think about it or not. All right. So the next person I want to talk about is a man named Hammurabi. Now, I mentioned him earlier. He was one of the earliest kings of Babylon. Now, you know him by a different name. You know him as King Amphrael, king of Shinar. If you look in Genesis chapter 14, verse 1, we've actually read it before in this series. Whenever the 5 kings go to war against the 5 kings in the story of Abraham, and whenever Lot is kidnapped. Well, Amphrael is one of the kings that kidnapped Lot. And so he is recognized not only in the religious community, but in the secular community as one and the same. Now, when those two agree with something, you kind of believe it's probably true. That they both agree that this is the same person. It's something to do with the root name of Amphrael and the root name of Shinar going down 2 different language trees. I don't know that part of it. But they both agree this is the same person. So now you have in history, you have a place for Hammurabi in the Bible. All right, so he is in the time of Abraham. So you have a place marked there. Now, Hammurabi is credited with building the city walls of Babylon. He is the first one to actually make the city a city, to make it fortified. So he is the person. Now, Hammurabi is better known for his code of laws. How many of you have heard of Hammurabi's code of laws? 1, 2, 3-ish. All right. Well, I'm going to tell you about Hammurabi's code of laws. Now, this is written early on in the history of mankind, one of the first set of laws set down for mankind to follow. Now, you can find renditions and translations of Hammurabi's laws throughout the Middle East. Now, the one that is most noted that we have found is this one here. It's a black basalt stone, 7.5 foot tall, and the entire code is written on this stone. Now, this was found in Susa, which is in eastern Iran, just outside of the Iraqi border. So it had traveled from Babylon and it had been found there. Now, Hammurabi's code has been found all over. Copies of it have been found all over. But his laws has been morphed into a lot of different laws of the Middle East. Now, interestingly enough, and not surprisingly, it is written prior to Mosaic law, but it has a lot of similarities. Now, this is where we as Christians need to be prepared for that, because one of the arguments is that the Mosaic law is just a copy of Hammurabi's earlier laws. And people say Moses was just copying something that was already out there. Okay, well, he's right. Whoever says that is correct. Hammurabi wrote his laws first. Moses came second. That's a date thing. That's just chronological date. So how do you argue that? Well, I have the answer for you. If you look at Romans 2, turn in your Bibles there. Romans 2, verses 14 and 15. It says, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law, since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, in their consciences, also bearing witnesses, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them." The law is written on mankind's heart. Whenever we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, we got that gift. We all know right from wrong. It was the gift and the curse. So it is written on the hearts of all mankind, including Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi distorted some of that right and wrong. He knew right from wrong, but he put his own twist on it. And so if you look at Hammurabi's overall law, I mean, there was no gender equality, there was racial inequality, there was status and class involved, free man versus slave, they're treated differently. So they had that. He didn't have it right. But the fact that they were similar does not surprise me. But this is what the argument you're going to run into. I mean, let me just read 1 or 2 of the laws just so you see what they're saying. Exodus 21, it says, "If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he shall serve, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing." Hammurabi's law of 117, "If a man becomes involved in a debt and gives his wife or his son or his daughter for silver or for labor, they shall serve 3 years in the house of their purchaser or bondmaster, and in the 4th year they should go free." Okay, similar wording. How about this one? Exodus 21:24, "Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot." Now, you've heard that in the New Testament as well as the Old. Hammurabi 196, if a man destroy the eye of a free man, his eye shall be destroyed. 197, if he break the bone of a free man, his bone shall be broken. 200, if a man knock out the teeth of a man of the same rank, his teeth shall be knocked out. Kind of hard to argue that they don't sound the same, right? Hammurabi wrote it first. Moses wrote it second. Kind of hard to argue that. But it is written on the hearts of all mankind that it is fair, it is right, it is law. And so whenever you get that argument, pull up Romans 2. Now, another man we want to look at tonight is King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we are familiar with him. We know him from Daniel, most predominantly. Now, that man, how can we describe Nebuchadnezzar? He's powerful, he's arrogant, he's vain, and he's passionate. Those are the four descriptors I keep coming to mind every time I read about him. So what is the first thing we really see Nebuchadnezzar happen? Well, he has a dream. And he has this dream, and according to Josephus, Nebuchadnezzar has the dream and forgets what the dream is. So he has his wise men come in and say, tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me what the meaning is. Now, all of you have had that happen where you wake up, it's something scared you in your dream and you don't remember what it was. Happens. That's apparently what happened to King Neb. He forgot what he dreamed, but he knew it was important. So he said, I want wise men of the world, or my kingdom, to tell me what it means and tell me what it was. Well, of course, the wise men can't do that. And he decides to kill all the wise men in the country. He's powerful. He's arrogant. He's passionate. He's not that bright. Kill all the wise men. That just doesn't seem like a good idea. But this is the king we're talking about. Daniel comes in and says, King, give me one day. I'll tell you what you dreamed, and I'll tell you what it means. And Daniel does exactly that. He tells him about the statue. What does the king do? He praises the God of Daniel. Second instance, we see King Nebuchadnezzar. He has a dream about a statue, so he builds a statue. It sounds like a good idea. So he builds a statue, and everyone is supposed to worship this statue, except for three guys. They don't decide no, they want to do that. Now, these three guys make him mad. He throws them into the fire. The guy is arrogant. The guy is passionate. Now, those three guys don't burn, and neither does the fourth guy. And so he gets them out, and what does he do? He praises the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And on top of that, he decrees that anyone who speaks out against their God would be destroyed. That's a passionate man. To defend a God. That's what he does. The third instance that we have, he has a second dream. It's the dream of the tree. The tree is a magnificent, beautiful tree. And it's, everyone from all around comes to shelter under its shade and eat from its fruit. And the tree is cut down, and it's shackled to the ground. And he calls Daniel in and says, Daniel, what does this mean? He says, oh, king, you don't want to know. But he says, King, this is going to happen to you. You will be torn down, and you'll be turned into a wild animal. 12 months later, the king is walking around his palace and says, what a beautiful place I have built. The man is vain. The man is arrogant. And he loses his mind. According to Josephus, he wanders the fields for 7 years. And after 7 years, he looks to heaven and he praises God. That is the man who understood God's power. And he's returned to the throne. That in and of itself, after 7 years, is a miracle. You saw what the Assyrians were used to. If somebody's not on the throne, we're going to fill it real quick. And if you don't want you on the throne, we're going to throw you out. 7 years, the throne remains empty. That has the hand of God all over it. I got to thinking about this as I was putting the timelines together. I thought, who do you think was in charge while he was gone? Could have been one of those 4 men that he praised highly, thought highly of. I don't know. Possible. But for 4 years, that throne remained empty, held for Nebuchadnezzar. I can only kind of imagine that. That had to be awkward for the courtiers. The Pharaoh walks up and says, I'm here to see King Nebuchadnezzar, and the courtiers say, well, he's out in the back 40 eating. We'll come around to him, and eventually he'll come back. Yeah, eating grass. This is Nebuchadnezzar. So he is a powerful man. He is an arrogant man, but he is passionate. Whatever he does, whatever he puts his mind to. He made the most beautiful city on the planet. He makes the most powerful kingdom of the time. And then you look at this statue of the dream. And we're going to look at this. We're looking at this several times over the next several lessons. Now, the head is of Babylon. That is where this story starts whenever Daniel starts telling him what this means. He says, these are the kingdoms that will follow you. So you have the Medes and the Persians are the chest and the arms of silver. Then the belly and the thighs are of bronze. That was Greece. Then you have the legs of iron, which was Rome. Then you have the feet that were made with iron mixed with clay. And that is supposedly the nation states that followed in Europe. And then you have the stone cut out of the rock, but not by human hands. That is the coming of Christ, or the church. Depends on how you look at it. I haven't got there yet. I'll tell you what I think in a few months. But that's the second coming of Christ. But look at the head. What does it represent? Daniel says, this is you, Nebuchadnezzar. This is you. The gold, the most shining part, most precious metal to anybody at the time. It's beautiful. It's not the hardest metal. It's not the strongest metal, but it's most beautiful. That was Babylon. And as we see, I think there was more to this organization than we thought as we look at the rest of these civilizations coming forward. We give Nebuchadnezzar a hard time. We give Babylon a hard time too, being the bad guys. They really weren't. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind as we look at these civilizations. These civilizations were always on the opposition of Israel, but not always on the opposition of God. That's sometimes hard to grasp, and I mentioned that last time. But Babylon was chosen to take his people. And his people flourished there. You had Daniel, you had Shadrach, you had Meshach, you had Abednego. I mean, they were in lead positions. That's not really what you do with slaves. So they were being punished. They were taken away from their homeland. And you see the next kingdom do their thing, and then the next kingdom does something similar and just keeps going. But don't think of these civilizations as bad kingdoms. Don't ever think that. That's why I'm excited it's a World Heritage Site, and I don't want it obliterated off the face of the planet. Because it has value. It did then, it does now. That is Babylon for tonight. Thank y'all. We're looking at Persia and Media next time.